a thought to Africa 'neath the burning sun. I'm Erin Johnson-Williams, a Leverhulme Early Career Fellow in the Department of Music. Broadly speaking, my research focuses on systems of musical power and how British imperialism impacted systems of musical education in the late 19th century. In my PhD research, I looked at how musical institutions in late 19th century London were impacted by systems of musical accreditation, such as the Associated Board of the Royal Schools of Music, which we know now as the ABRSM, and is still very much in play today, was shaped by systems of financial capital by the end of the 19th century. I came to this research as a musician who grew up largely in the Commonwealth. While I'm American, I spent a large amount of my youth in New Zealand, where to be a proper musician, you were encouraged to take accredited musical exams, such as the ABRSM exams, to gain your grades. And I started to ask why these graded systems in the Commonwealth, across the world, across the post-colonial world, were still examined by examiners who flew out all the way from London. So I started to apply this to theories of post-colonialism and political history that I was studying as an undergrad and later as a postgrad student. So an example of this can be found in the article I recently had published in the Journal of the Royal Musical Association, which is entitled "The Examiner and the Evangelist, Authorities of Music and Empire, circa 1894. In this piece of writing, my starting point was asking the question, what systems of musical power were at place in shaping institutions of musical education in both late 19th century South Africa and Britain? Another starting question was, how do imperial musical practices from the 19th century play out in systems of musical education that are still in place today, both in Britain and the post-colonial world? This is particularly important in light of conversations in 2020 and 2021 in light of Black Lives Matter and decolonization. So my starting point when I approached the history of the ABRSM was looking at their first examining tour abroad in 1894 to colonial South Africa, starting in Cape Town. The newspapers at the time, such as the Musical News, published the minutes of the ABRSM annual dinner in July 1894, at which Sir George Grove, the president at the time, rose to give a toast to Franklin Taylor, who I call in the article the Examiner, who says he will forsake his chair for several months to go and examine the black man. Now, this was an ironic comment at the time, given that in his first examining tour of over 200 candidates, all of them were white. So one thing I did was I started to look at this examining tour and ask myself what musical practices were actually happening on the ground in 19th century South Africa in terms of how British colonialism was actually affecting musical practice at large. And what I found was that while these examining tours of the ABRSM, which was extremely, had a lot of financial and cultural capital at the time, while those were being publicized widely in the British musical press, a lot of the actual work of British musical colonialism that was happening on the ground had to do in the churches, had to do with what I call missionary imperialism, and had to do with the wide circulation of hymns in what was called tonic solfa notation, which was a different kind of musical notation. And you'll see this in the example I provide here. This was a notation that had been used in 19th century Britain for a lot of working class education and a lot of nonconformist hymn services. What I found when looking at 19th century South Africa was that the hymns in tonic solfa notation were by far more prevalent and long-lasting in terms of the actual permeability of colonial musical education than the sort of elite systems of the ABRSM. So what I did in terms of tracing a sort of movement of musical colonialism at this time was I found that in 1894, as Franklin Taylor was sent out from the ABRSM on a ship to Cape Town, that very year, a black Xhosa composer, John Knox Bokwe, who was a nonconformist minister and a composer of many hymns in his native language as well as in English, was publishing several hymn books in Xhosa notation at the time and was using those hymns as a way to also travel back to Britain, where his hymns were widely sung to concert audiences in Britain at the time by the South African Choir, which is a choir of Black South Africans that toured 19th century Britain. And what I found was, when looking at these stories in 1894 of Franklin Taylor, the musical examiner, traveling to colonial South Africa, and John Knox Bakoi, the musical evangelist, traveling from South Africa to Britain, is that of the two systems of musical education, the nonconformist hymn offered perhaps the more flexible navigation of resistance and aesthetic incorporation of empire than the sort of elite financial structure of the ABRSM, which gave me, in light of triangulating this within post-colonial and decolonial studies, a way to navigate how systems of imperialism that tended to play out in nonconformist structures rather than secular ones have offered South Africa long-lasting ways to negotiate a post-colonial musicality.